What is happening in Guantanamo? Why is Guantanamo known as one of the most notorious prisons in the world? Are human rights consistent with what America is doing in Guantanamo? Why does America violate human rights in the world? What is the condition of Guantanamo prisoners and what conditions are they living in? Guantanamo is one of the prisons built under the authorization of the United States of America in Cuba and does not value any kind of international laws. What condition is the last Afghan prisoner Mohammed Rahim al-Afghani living in? In this interview, we will discuss these major issues that you may also have questions about. This interview is a window to the secrets behind the walls of Guantanamo, which is narrated by one of the lawyers of many Guantanamo prisoners, Mr. Clive Stafford Smith. Hello, Mr. Clive.
Nice to see you.
How are you doing?
Right.
It's a pleasure to have you in Afghanistan. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, Omar, let me say thank you very much for having me on the program. My name's Clive Stafford Smith. I'm a human rights lawyer. I spent the last 40 years representing people, always for nothing, because that's my mission. My mum made me do it. My mother told me, you're a privileged white male. You need to get out there and help the people who need your help.
So what brings you to Afghanistan?
Well, I'm here for two reasons. One is to continue to help the prisoners in Guantanamo, and the other is on the case of Afia Siddiqui, a Pakistani woman who's suffering in America like no one else.
Okay. Did America ever have the right to invade Afghanistan?
Way back when the 9/11 happened, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, the Americans are going to invade the country. And it's just madness. This is never going to do any good. And one of the problems with the United States is people don't know their history. And legally, no, they didn't have a right to attack Afghanistan. But there's also the matter of practicality. If you know your history, you'll know that the British tried to attack Afghanistan 3 times in what we call the First Afghan War, the Second Afghan War, the Third Afghan War. And then the Russians tried, of course, and then the Americans, and it all ended up the same way.
Okay.
I remember when I was in Waziristan with Imran Khan, who's an old friend of mine, he insisted on taking me to a graveyard where he said his Pashtun ancestors killed my ancestors in the First British War. And, it's just an incredibly stupid way to try to solve your problems. We could, after 9/11, which was a shocking thing, we could have insisted on some sort of criminal trial. And I think the then government of Afghanistan would have agreed to that.
Okay.
No one would have got killed, and we would have had some justice for everybody. But instead, we had the nightmare that's been going on for 20 years.
So what is Guantanamo Bay and what's it made for?
So what we did, what the Americans did in the end, was having attacked Afghanistan, the US captured lots of people, and they had to be seen to be doing something about what they called terrorism. And so in the early days of the war, the Americans didn't capture anyone of significance. They didn't achieve anything of any significance.
Yeah.
And what they wanted to do was they wanted to take a number of people and put them in a prison, but they wanted to keep it all secret so they could say that they were achieving something in this war. So starting on January the 11th, 2002, they started to bring Muslim men, only Muslim men, into Cuba, and they put them in Cuba so that the US government could avoid giving them legal rights. And it was another catastrophic mistake.
The largest number of prisoners in Guantanamo are Afghans. Are there still any Afghans left?
There is one Afghan left, and that's Mohammed Rahim.
Okay.
And Mohammed Rahim is a really important story, and it's really important for the people of Afghanistan to know it. I'm trying to help him myself, along with some other people. But he was considered by the Americans in a classic example of getting everything wrong. They thought Mohammed Rahim was a big-time Al-Qaeda terrorist, and he just never was. And what happened to him was a typical story of Guantanamo, that the majority of people who ended up in Guantanamo Bay were sold by the Pakistan government under Musharraf for bounties to the Americans. So the Americans paid lots of money. I mean, Umar, how much would I have to pay you to snitch on me and say that I was a terrorist? How much would you take?
Quite a lot.
I'm offering you $250,000. Would you do it?
Depends on person.
Yeah, you would. So what happened to Mohammed Rahim, which is really dreadful, is he was in Lahore, in Pakistan, minding his own business. He was with his family, and they'd gone for a picnic, and they were coming back on a bus when the authorities raided the bus, and for a bounty, they seized him, and they turned him over to the Americans with a big story saying he was some bad dude. And so consequently, Mohammed Rahim got listed in Guantanamo as what they call an HVD, a high-value detainee, as opposed to all the other guys. And as a result, he's stayed there. He's languished there for longer than anyone else. But he really is not guilty of anything. And we need to get him back to Afghanistan as soon as we can.
Okay, so, but why Cuba?
Well, the Americans chose Cuba because if you come to the United States, even though you're not an American citizen, you get to enjoy all the rights of the US Constitution.
Yep.
But if we have you somewhere that's not the United States territory, technically, then US law doesn't apply to you, so you have none of those protections. So the idea, you've got to remember that America was having this war on terror because they wanted to promote, they said, democracy and the rule of law around the world, unlike Al-Qaeda. And so the first thing the United States did was take 780 Muslim men to Cuba, give them no legal rights, and choose Cuba because that way they could try to deny them any rights. And that was the whole idea, which is why it's such a hypocritical thing to do.
Will Guantanamo ever close?
I mean, I wrote a piece for Al Jazeera a while back about taking my grandson. I don't have a grandson, right? I've got a son, he's 15, so he's going to have a son before I have a grandson. But it was an imagination of taking my grandson to Guantanamo Bay in 20 years' time, when I'm afraid I'll be 84, and show him the Museum to Human Folly, which I think they should have in Guantanamo. But I'm afraid it won't close for quite a long time yet, because there are now only 30 people left, right? We've got 97% of all the prisoners out of Guantanamo. But of the 30 people left, there are 10, only 10, who I think in the end the Americans will put through a trial process. And you've got to remember, here we are 20 years on, they haven't done that yet. And some of those people will almost certainly be sentenced to a long-term life in prison and will die in Guantanamo. So I think Guantanamo will be a bit, I don't know if you remember in World War II, the West had got a bunch of Nazis and convicted them of various crimes. And they had a prison in Berlin to hold them. And in the end, there was just one guy left who was 85 years old. And they had this whole massive prison just to hold one person. I think Guantanamo will probably still be there with one old guy waiting to die in the place, you know? It's terrible, sad.
So is iguana protected under the law?
Well, ironically, yes, if you're an animal, an iguana, in Guantanamo Bay, and I were to kick you, then I would get 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine. But if you're a Muslim male in Guantanamo Bay and I were to kick you, nothing happens. And when we were arguing this whole case in the Supreme Court to try to get rights for the prisoners in Guantanamo, the government was saying these prisoners should have no legal rights. And at one point we took the position that, oh look, just give Muslim men the same rights as iguanas and we'll be way better off.
The animals got more rights than Muslims.
Yeah, equal rights with iguanas, that was our slogan. It's really important, I think, if you want to understand how crazy the whole Guantanamo process is, it's important to have a story or two about what the Americans did. I've got to say my favorite story of all was a young lad I represented who was 14 years old when he went to Guantanamo. And his name was Mohammed El-Ghorani, and he was from Saudi Arabia, but he was black, he was from Chad, and the Saudis are pretty discriminatory. And they wouldn't let him go to secondary school. So he decided he was going to go to Pakistan and learn English and all this good stuff and get an education. And he had no idea when he went there that 9/11 was about to happen. And when 9/11 happened, he was sold for a bounty, like so many other people, to the Americans by someone who said that he was a terrorist. And when they were interrogating him, the Americans don't speak Arabic, right? So they had to use translators. And Mohammed spoke Arabic from Saudi Arabia, where the word zalat means salad. But they had a translator from Yemen, where the word zalat means money.
Oh.
And so the Americans wanted to know this about Mohammed, what were you doing in Pakistan? And they said, what zalat did you take with you to go to Pakistan? And, the Americans meant money. But Mohammed thought they were talking about salad. Oh. And so he thought these people were just very stupid. And he said, I didn't have any zalat. And they got very angry with him, and they started slapping him. And they said, you had to have zalat. And they're talking about money. And so he said, I could get zalat anywhere I needed it. And he was talking about salad. And so they were really excited, the Americans were. We thought, we're going to find out where Al-Qaeda has its money. So they asked him, where could you get zalat in Karachi? And he listed a number of vegetable stalls where he could get tomatoes and vegetables. And the Americans wrote this down, and they thought they'd just discovered where all the money from Al-Qaeda came from. And they then charged Mohammed with being a 26-year-old Al-Qaeda financier. And this poor 14-year-old, I met him in Guantanamo, lovely kid. And it took us 2 or 3 years to get him out of there. Because we finally proved by just calling Saudi Arabia, how old is this child? They sent us a birth certificate, and we proved he'd been 14.
Okay, so did America ever agree or apply Geneva Convention humanitarian law in Afghanistan?
Unfortunately, even though we were, the American government was the people who really helped write the Geneva Conventions after World War II. And the Geneva Conventions give everyone legal rights, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who you are. And they're meant to make warfare a little less unpleasant. But the Americans decided that they weren't going to apply those laws to terrorists. Now, there's nothing in humanitarian law that says that's okay. So to begin with, they said they weren't going to apply the Geneva Conventions at all. And they could just, what that means is if I capture you, I can just shoot you, or I can torture you, or whatever. In the end, when we embarrassed them quite a lot, they backed down a bit, and they said what we call Article 3 applies, which means we're not allowed to actually torture people, the Americans. But they didn't even respect that. I mean, they tortured people too. So the bottom line was they simply ignored international law the whole time over Guantanamo.
What is your opinion about the human rights defined by America in view of what is happening in Guantanamo?
It's a very sad thing. I'm a human rights lawyer, right?
Okay.
I mean, my life is about helping people who are oppressed with human rights. And it's really important. It's really powerful. But the United States has never ratified any human rights convention that's enforceable against them, right?
Yep.
So that means that if we violate your human rights, if the United States violates your human rights, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, that's so wrong, because one day, the United States won't be the top dog anymore. China will probably be the top dog. And at that point, the Americans are going to need human rights, and they're very short-sighted that they think that if they mistreat people now, someone won't mistreat them in the future. So, no, unfortunately, there's no human rights.
So what is happening in Guantanamo? Is this legal?
Nothing about Guantanamo is legal, but it's also just immoral. I mean, when there was a CIA agent back in 2004 who recognized what we were doing in Guantanamo, that we were torturing people, the Americans were. And he said that for every prisoner in Guantanamo, we're provoking 10 angry young Muslim men to hate us such that they want to blow us up. Now, that was 2004. It's now 2024. I think the numbers are much bigger. And when the United States assassinated bin Laden, they found in his cache of documents a list of everybody who was a member of Al-Qaeda in 2001. And it was one page, and it had 120 names on it, several of which were bin Laden's brothers and sisters and sons and whatever, and 20 of whom were dead already. Al-Qaeda was a tiny, tiny organization of very little consequence. But because of what the United States has done, I mean, let me ask you, Omar, does it anger you that the United States says we're all about human rights, but we're going to torture you? Does that make you,
Well, of course.
How does that make you feel?
It makes me angry, doesn't it?
Well, what do you feel about Mohammed Rahim being locked up for 20 years without a trial?
Yeah, I think it's quite unfair because he hasn't been given a trial. Well, he has, but nothing's been...
He hasn't.
So nothing's been proven anyway. They haven't got no evidence against him, but he's been held there for 20, 21 years.
But if I say, look, I'm America, we're all about human rights, and we think you should be about human rights, you should treat women better, and this, that, and the other, and then we don't give Mohammed Rahim a trial, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel angry.
Yeah.
Because you're coming at me for not giving rights to women in my country, but you can't give men in your country rights.
Yeah.
That are being held against.
I think it's true that hypocrisy is what creates anger and hatred.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm afraid Guantanamo Bay is a great example of American hypocrisy.
So let's hear a story about Guantanamo.
I've been to Guantanamo 42 times, right?
Okay.
It is my Caribbean resort of choice, obviously.
Yeah.
And the whole place is just a teeny bit mad. It's like an American village. There's a McDonald's there, right? And even, Ronald McDonald, do you know who that is?
Ronald McDonald, no.
He's the character, the face of McDonald's. Any McDonald's you go into has a Ronald McDonald. Well, Ronald McDonald is behind bars in the McDonald's in Guantanamo Bay, which I think is very ironic. And then you drive along and you turn right on Recreation Road, and there's a golf course there, and you drive down, and the motto of Guantanamo Bay is honor bound to defend freedom. And, that's what they say it's all about. And, the first time I went there, we were going into the McDonald's, and there was this colonel who was with me, because I'm not allowed to wander around. I had a shepherd to make sure I don't do anything naughty. And as we're going in, this junior soldier comes out and says, honor bound, sir. And the colonel salutes back and says, to defend freedom, soldier. And I laughed. I thought this was a joke. I thought they were doing this to amuse me.
Yeah.
And they got very offended. But, there is no sense of irony in Guantanamo. And they use the language so they can lie, right? So, for example, Mohammed Rahim, the last Afghan, was held in solitary confinement for many, many years. But that's torture, right? To put people in a tiny room all by himself.
Yep.
But the Americans would look you in the eye and say, we don't do solitary confinement. And that's because they'd changed the language, and they call it a single cell operation, an SCO. And that apparently is something other than solitary confinement when you're stuck in a single cell. And they say there are no children, no juveniles in Guantanamo. Whereas, one of your Afghans here, Mohammed Jawad, was only 14 when we took him to Guantanamo. 14, for goodness sake. And the Americans lied about him being a juvenile because they changed the definition of juvenile. So they say that if you're 14 when we take you to Guantanamo, but we hold you for 2 years, now you're 16, you're no longer a juvenile, and therefore we can hold you. It's just, the whole thing is a massive lie. It's just horrendous.
So what is it like having these Guantanamo prisoners in power now in Afghanistan?
I've been to Afghanistan a few times, and I came here in 2017 when the Americans were still here. And it was horrible. I mean, it was dangerous. You couldn't go anywhere. No one, I couldn't get to the places I needed to go.
Okay.
Since I've been coming here for the last little while with the people who were held in Guantanamo Bay, it's a whole different world. I mean, number one, it's incredibly safe in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Number two, I met some of the people who were in Guantanamo, including, for example, Wasik, for whom I have immense respect, right? And he's head of your Directorate of Intelligence. What a nice person. And he was so incredibly helpful. He insisted on giving me personal security guards. And I did say to these lovely guards, they were really nice people, I said, look, I'm going to Texas next week. I really need you there. It's dangerous. They pull guns on me all the time. But I don't need you here in Afghanistan. But the most important thing, I mean, look, I'm sure we'd all agree that there's no country that's perfect, and Afghanistan has its problems. But to have people in power who truly understand what it means to be put in a prison like Guantanamo is so important. My whole life has been about representing people in prison in America mostly. And here I can talk to people in power and they get it. Whereas in Britain and America, they have no earthly idea.
So why do you do this for a living?
Well, I don't do it for much of a living. I work for charity. But one of the problems if you're a person in Guantanamo, it was really highlighted for me when I went to Yemen back in 2003. And I went to Yemen and we were trying to help the prisoners. And to do that, we had to meet the families. Now, if you're a Yemeni family, your annual income is $300 on average, right? Was back then, per year. Okay. If you want to hire an American corporate lawyer to represent you, they're going to charge you $3,000 an hour. That means if you don't eat as a Yemeni for a whole year and you give your $300 to this lawyer, the lawyer will give you 6 minutes of his time, which is not enough to have a cup of coffee. It was my view back then that because America was doing something so profoundly wrong, I believe to the bottom of my heart what we've done in Guantanamo is just wrong on every level, that it's our duty to make up for it. And so I would go to Yemen, I'd hold a press conference, and I'd say, look, I'm here to represent you for free to try to get some justice for your relative, your loved one. And, you know, that's what I've done. That's what a few other lawyers have done, because it's the only way anyone's ever going to get any help, isn't it? Because they can't possibly afford it themselves. I've never represented anyone for money because they don't have money.
Of course.
And I have a son. His name's Will. And the thing that's...
So how is she cooperating? How is she doing in the jail?
It's here somewhere. I don't know where yet. And I'm desperate for people